obviously affected by beach bark disease here in the Great Lakes states. Then you've got, that's a cherry right there. You've got a large standing beech, which is the gray smooth bark behind it. I know y'all probably, most of you studied trees at some point, but sometimes if you haven't done it in a while, you don't remember. What's right behind Aaron is a sugar maple, hard maple. Somebody asked me earlier the difference between, and I apologize, I hope I answered your question correctly because it was hard to hear.
Yeah.
Was the difference between hard maple and soft maple. Hard maple is sugar maple, soft maple is red maple. The main difference on the cut lumber is hard maple obviously is harder, it has a higher strength, but it is actually whiter and tends to be whiter. Soft maple, depending on where it's grown, can be a little bit yellower. It can have a reddish brown heart. Actually, they both can, but the soft maple is odd. It varies across our state. I did a lot of my forestry work when I worked at a sawmill and I was buying wood. That was in the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan on the other side of the Mackinac Bridge. That soft maple looks a lot different than the soft maple here in this area. So some of those species will look a little different on the cut lumber side than what they do in other areas. So, but this is very typical in terms of, it's beautiful too. That is a beautiful tree behind you, by the way.
That's a nice maple.
That is a nice maple tree. That's a nice cherry tree.
That cherry should have been defected. It goes up and it crotches out. And like, if this woods had been managed properly, that one would have been cut out 30 years ago.
Oh.
Yeah, you don't
that
like
one
those
would've been cut out
crotches.
30
They
years ago.
split out in the wind.
Limits the lifespan of the tree as well. It's not going to grow as tall, it's not going to grow as old, and it's not going to yield as well.
How old are these? How old is
Oh, probably about 80.
I guess probably about
it? 80 years old?
About 80 years old. Most of Michigan, for those of you who don't know, most of Michigan was completely cut over, like wiped right down to nothing, about 120 years ago during
Wow.
the big lumbering days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was-
Chicago burned down.
Chicago burned down, and the lumber barons wanted to basically rebuild Chicago, and they got all the softwood and hardwood lumber from Michigan, and it went across and on rail, and it went down on boats. But yeah, Michigan, and then after it was all cut over, then a giant wildfire came through and swept from one side of the state to the other side of the state. So most of what you see is somewhere between 80 and 120 years old.
I have a plat book from the late 1800s, and their entire townships were owned by the logging companies.
Yep.
Like Cumber Diggins was the big logging company up here. They didn't own sections. They owned township after township after township. And I mean, so like out of a
Miles.
county, they might own 25 to 30% of a county is what they had locked up in timber contracts to work with. So I mean, a lot of the land up here, Michigan was